Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on the topic Inclusive Education for Filipino Children on the Move, Making the Invisible Visible. This webinar is co-organized by the University of the Philippines, CIFAL Philippines, the University of the Philippines Asian Center, the Commission on Filipinos Overseas, the Department of Education, Diaspora for Education, and the United Nations Children's Fund. My name is Marla Asis. I'm Executive Director of the Scalabrini Migration Center, and I thank the organizers for inviting me to be moderator for this seminar. Every Filipino parent aspires for his or her child to have an education, and specifically to complete a college education. When parents encourage their children to study well, they are wont to say, "Tanging edukasyon lang ang maipapamana namin sa iyo." At hindi lang yon. Ang edukasyon ay yaman na hindi maaaring maaagaw o mananakaw ng iba. It is this dream to see their children acquire a diploma that motivates Filipino parents to work abroad. Study after study has found that funding their children's education is one of the uses to which Filipino families use remittances. And Filipino migrants also continue to work until their children have completed their education. As a major origin country of international migrants, particularly temporary migrant workers, we are all witness to the separation of migrants and their families. Because migrant workers in less skilled occupations are not allowed to bring their family members with them, temporary labor migration has created transnational families, a situation where migrants work abroad while leaving their families behind. In the Philippines, public perceptions about the educational experience of the left-behind children of overseas Filipino workers tend to be negative. In general, left-behind children are perceived as not doing well in school or dropping out of school altogether, and this is often cited as one of the social costs of labor migration. Interestingly, however, research findings tend to suggest otherwise. Contrary to popular perceptions, the children of migrants are doing as well, if not better, compared to the children of non-migrants. Among others, this positive impact may be due to the contributions of remittances to children's education. In the Philippines, we hear less about the educational experience of Filipino children who migrate with their parents. And this is the focus of this webinar. Children who migrate are a very diverse population. They could be migrating for permanent resettlement to traditional immigration countries, such as the US, Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, or they accompany their parents, typically those in high-skilled or professional occupations who work overseas. Or they migrate through unauthorized channels, or they were born in foreign countries to migrant parents in an irregular situation. Their legal status and family income could determine their access to education outside of the Philippines. We will hear more about this from the main paper that will be presented by Dr. Celero in a short while. And in addition, we will have further insights which will be shared by our panel of reactors who represent media, government, and civil society. I understand that more than 8,000 participants registered for this event, mostly teachers and educators all over the Philippines. This is a blockbuster, in other words. Our program consists of a brief overview on the right to education, followed by the presentation of the main paper, then the reactions and insights from four panelists, after which we pause for a 5-minute break, then we proceed to the Q&A and of course the closing remarks. We have already received some questions in advance, but I invite our online participants to ask questions or share comments and observations. Please use the chat box for this purpose. We hope we will have enough time for the Q&A later. So let's get started. To set the stage, particularly in situating the issue of education as a basic right for children, we have a representative from the United Nations Children's Fund who will provide an overview on this topic. The presentation will be made by Ms. Teresita Felipe, the Basic Education Specialist of the United Nations Children's Fund, Philippines. Ms. Felipe served the Department of Education for 25 years in different positions as Executive Director of the Educational Development Projects Implementing Task Force or EDPITAP, as well as Director for Planning and Assistant Secretary for Planning and Development. She later worked with different development organizations, namely USAID Equals 2 Project, USAID, and UNICEF. She is a strong advocate for education equity, inclusion, and quality learning for the most disadvantaged children and youth. Ms. Philippi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Assis. Can you share my slide? Make it a bit bigger. So my part is just a very, very brief overview on the rights to education broadly, and then zero in a little bit on children on the move. On the next slide, it summarizes the frameworks around rights-based education. And it is really based on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, principle of non-discrimination, best interest of the child, survival and development, and respect for the views of the child. And then SDG 4, and then dating back in education for all. In the next slide, rights-based approach really underpins global interventions for all children. And UNICEF is very happy to join the University of the Philippines, CIFAL Philippines, in partnership with the UP Asian Center today. We believe that this is a very timely forum to unpack issues of marginalized children, specifically children on the move. So I would like to share with you on the next slide a very moving video to understand issues around children's rights. Can you play the video, please?
They say, children should be seen and not heard. They say, you'll understand when you're older. You're just a kid. But a kid swam for 3 hours on the open sea to save 18 lives and became an activist for refugees. A kid broke through barriers to keep migrant families together and delivered a message of hope.
Let us fight with love, faith, and courage so that our families will not be destroyed.
A kid was forced to kill in a brutal civil war and became a human rights activist, freeing other children from violence. A kid fought for girls' right to education, was shot in the head in retaliation, and won the Nobel Prize.
This award is not just for me. It is for those forgotten children who want education, who want peace, who want change.
And a kid spoke truth to power, inspiring a historic movement against climate change.
We kids shouldn't have to do this. I wish that the adults would take their responsibility and do this instead. But since no one's doing anything, we have to.
Kids are speaking up. Kids are demanding their rights. Kids are acting now for a better tomorrow. What will you do?
So the question is, what will we all do? So children are speaking out about their rights. Behind some of these children who speak up are adults that have supported and encouraged them to stand up for their rights. And for this, I really commend the organizers of this forum. I see you as behind fulfilling. And on the next slide, let's try to unpack again the issues. And I would like to mention just one issue in the Philippines, which is children who are not in school because of miserable conditions. And you can see that in the slide. And they're not the only marginalized, others are affected by disaster, conflict, etc. On this slide, you will see the framework, which has 3 circles. And I would like to emphasize the 3rd circle on the right, which is the right to respect in the learning environment. So it doesn't talk about a nice learning environment, but respecting and promoting the optimum development of everyone. Okay, so on the next slide, let's zoom a little bit. What do we mean by right to access? On the next slide. So it's education at all stages, not ending in elementary, but up to basic education, at least, at minimum. And accessibility, including for those who are with disabilities. And of course, equality of opportunity. On the next slide, access is about, next slide, please. Yeah, access is about inclusive curriculum. So we're not saying there is one standard curriculum, but it has to be reflective of every child needs. And also on learning assessment and having a child-friendly. On the respect to environment, which is the slide in front of you, the third circle, which I mentioned, very important, respecting each other's identity, respect for participation, and of course, the integrity of one another. If every child, every person will adhere to this, I think we will have a successful learning environment. That's the meaning of the third circle. And on the next slide, this one, next slide, please. The framework, the rights-based framework really highlights the need for a holistic approach to education. A previous slide, please. Previous slide. Haha, nawala. Yan. I just would like to emphasize the word holistic. Oh, nawala. Can you go back to the slide with the key? Yan. Because what happened? Oops. One more. After that one. Sige pa. One more. Click one more. After that. Sige, after that. All right. So the framework, as I mentioned, ay, dumidiretso. Maybe you've timed it. It's holistic and it reflects the universality and indivisibility of all human rights. And I think this is the topic for today's forum. So with the survival and development right in the next slide, what does it mean in terms of the CRC? On the next slide, you will see specific articles in the CRC, which is, ang bilis. Why are you clicking so fast? Wait. Can you go back a little bit? Is it time? Ay, nawala. Yeah, because I want to emphasize the CRC as basis, because one of the rights of children is to understand their rights. So we want to make sure that we are able to underscore the legal basis of these rights. And mostly are really in the CRC specific articles. On your screen is the right to protection from all forms of violence, injury, neglect. And the right to express their right. And the freedom to expression, thought, conscience, and even religion. On the next slide is what UNICEF loves to talk about, the right to rest, play, and recreation. We always advocate for play-based learning because children, especially now with the technology, they really learn best if given some interactive materials to work with, and they can enhance their own self-learning skills. And the second bullet is what I also wish to emphasize, which affects migrant children, which is the right to protection from economic exploitation or hazardous work, which affects many children because they are illegal oftentimes in other countries, so they have to engage in exploitative kind of work. And the fourth bullet is the right to know about the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the implication to their lives. That's why as educators, it is our duty to ensure that every child understands their rights so they can advocate better, like in the video, and they can make decisions for themselves better as well. On the next slide is a brief UN policy brief just prepared for people on the move this June 2020. And there are 4 basic tenets to advancing safe and inclusive human mobility during and in the aftermath of COVID-19. And number 1 says, Exclusion is costly in the long run, whereas inclusion pays for everyone. And this is the message which we always talk globally, inclusion. Number two is that the COVID response to the response to COVID-19 and protecting human rights of people on the move are not mutually exclusive. We have to protect children on the move, people on the move, similarly as those that are affected by COVID. Number three is no one is safe until everyone is safe, which is very true. Four, people on the move are part of the solutions. So we are kind of giving these main messages to some of the forum that we talk about, but it's because this really talks about inclusion for all kind of protection and development. You can Google the UN policy brief because it's a long paper and it can provide you more insights of what do we mean by 1, 2, 3, 4, and what are the programmatic interventions around that. On the next slide, I will zero into education, which is my area. So the agenda is really reaching the most vulnerable. And when we say most vulnerable, I have encircled children on the move, the migrants, the refugees, internally displaced children. So it's really in the agenda of many development partners, many educators, children on the move. On the next slide, you will see some programmatic bridging interventions to reduce inequity in learning during COVID-19. And I would like to emphasize the second box, which talks about protection and inclusion of children on the move. So children on the move is really in the agenda, and it should be in the agenda. And some of the broad programmatic interventions, as you can see alongside that box, is consideration to reach children in camp. Maybe some people are doing house to house to give the food, but what about people in refugee camps? And maybe they need also hot meals, and they need some protection to mitigate against armed recruitment, especially for children in conflict affected areas. So on the next slide, these are broad UNICEF ongoing and future support. And what we're saying is that COVID-19 is an opportunity to build back better. We take COVID-19 emergency as an opportunity to help reduce disparities in access. Now we can talk more about disparities because of COVID. And that holds true for learning outcomes. And in many ministries, the focus is online learning. And second is gathering evidences and advocacies on strengthening systems. Again, we talk about inclusion, data systems who are excluded, and enhancing technical and financial partnerships, especially with the new demands of the new normal. My last slide, can you go to my slide, summarizes the guiding principles of UNICEF work, which is a rights-based approach. And I've discussed that. Focus on equity. There is a longer discussion on this. Maybe given another time, we can present more programmatic approaches to equity. Focus on inclusion and participation, because there's also an issue around inclusion. Yes, they are included, but they're not participating. That's an issue by itself. And then partnership and intersectoral collaboration is very important. That's why UNICEF is happy being invited by an academe, University of the Philippines. Now we can really work together. We can expand our wings, sort of, so that we can protect disadvantaged children. So this is the end of my presentation. I hope this provides some kind of a very brief overview that can springboard the more basic, detailed discussions later on. Thank you very much.
Okay. Maraming salamat po, Ms. Felipe, for that overview. It's very important. Na-highlight po sa kanyang presentation yung Convention on the Rights of Children. And it is a document that we need to know very well if we want to advance the rights of children, the different rights that children have. Ang kahalagahan po ng Convention on the Rights of Children, or CRC, is that it really lays down what are the rights of children. Dahil ito po ay convention at ito po ay isang international instrument, what it means is that countries and states that have ratified this convention have a responsibility to honor their commitments. No? So, pwede po natin itong gamitin ang document na ito para ipaalam po sa ating mga pamahalaan, sa ating pamahalaan, kung ano po yung kanilang responsibilidad towards children. And what is also very important to highlight here is that the CRC as an international instrument is widely ratified. So it is also a document that we can use when we want to lobby and to have advocacy activities in relation to destination countries where Filipino children are present. And also, I think another thing that has to be highlighted in the presentation by Ms. Philippe is also the focus of UNICEF on children on the move, which again is very important because for the most part, when we think of migrants as adults. Diba? Nagtatrabaho, migrants who go to other countries so that they can pursue higher education and so forth, but children are part of the population on the move. So thank you very much, Ms. Philippe, for that overview. We now turn to the presentation of Dr. Jocelyn Celero, who will discuss the education situation of migrant children. Dr. Jocelyn Celero is Assistant Professor at the Asian Center, University of the Philippines, Diliman. She obtained her PhD in International Studies at Waseda University. Her dissertation examined the transnational life trajectories of 1.5 and second-generation Japanese Filipinos. She has published on migration and transnationality of Filipino migrants and Japanese Filipinos. In 2017, she was New Scholar Associate at the Center for Global Social Policy, University of Toronto. Dr. Celero, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Marla. Can you hear me? Good afternoon to all. It is a privilege to be representing the UP Asian Center as well as CIFAL Philippines in this webinar. This study began last year, pre-COVID, and I would like to thank Kiel Suarez of CIFAL for the initial inputs, and for my research team, Michi, Aldrin, and Jillian for helping me put these together. It is a work in progress, and it aims to provide a review of existing empirical, statistical, multimedia, and policy research on Filipino migrant children's education situation, complemented by a mini survey and key informant interviews. Next, please. I would like to start with the case of Claire, whom I interviewed last week. She returned to the Philippines unemployed, together with her parents and 4 younger siblings who were forced to stop schooling in the light of the COVID crisis. Accustomed to several disruptions throughout her schooling, Claire believed her siblings would eventually get used to changing schools each time their parents changed company and job. They will remain in Manila before moving to Riyadh, where her engineer father found a new job in September. Next please. Claire and her 4 siblings are just 5 of the 392,821 Filipino children aged 14 to 24 who have left the Philippines between 2007 and 2017, contributing to 30 million children globally, or 12% of the 258 million migrants living outside their home country. Migrant children across the globe often face systemic challenges in relation to continuity of education acquired in home countries and accessing adequate education in destination countries. Next, please. To further explore these challenges, we must first identify or know who are Filipino migrant children or children on the move. Next, please. Existing scholarship shows 3 conceptual categories of a child migrant, namely second generation, or those Filipino children born and raised outside the Philippines. The lucky dito alluding to the immediate receiving country. The 1.5 generation Filipinos, on the other hand, refer to those born and raised in the Philippines, the so-called lucky doon referring to the distant Philippines, and moved overseas at the age of 18 and below to study and reunite with their migrant parents. The undocumented and stateless children are given the scantest attention in research due to their very complex migration and identity issues. Undocumented is a general term for those who moved without documentation and identification, rendering them stateless or a non-citizen of any country. In literature and country reports, they are interchangeably identified as refugees fleeing due to rebellion and extreme poverty, or internally displaced children due to natural disasters and other crises. Next, please. Many second and 1.5 generation Filipino migrant children live in destination countries where Filipinos have married, gained employment, and permanent residency, namely USA, Canada, Japan, Australia, Italy, New Zealand, UK, Germany, South Korea, and Spain. Next, please. Existing studies have examined the 1.5 generation whose mobile childhood becomes the root cause of their invisibility. They are schooled in at least two different, often incompatible elementary and secondary education systems. They straddle between two cultural orientations, one towards the Philippines, where they were born, grew up, and temporarily left behind, and the other one towards the host society, which often subjects them into learning a totally different language, history, and culture. How they overcome the linguistic and cultural barriers that affect their educational outcomes is oftentimes contingent upon the legal, economic, and cultural resources of their migrant parents, and the existence of migrant-friendly policies and programs in the receiving society. For instance, in Italy, there are language classes designed for migrant children. Next, please. There are undocumented and stateless children of Filipino migrants across Asia, but the most notable in research are those in Malaysia. Due to the absence of birth registration and transnational migration, there is no accurate data depicting the total number of undocumented Filipino children. UNHCR has a conservative estimate of 50,000 in Sabah alone, while UNICEF records about 1 million of them all over ASEAN, lumped together with refugees and IDPs. Next, please. Scholars Catherine Allerton and Linda Lumayag have categorized stateless children in Malaysia into 5. 1, those born to Filipino parents who are both undocumented and stateless. 2, those born to second-generation immigrant with expired, non-renewed IMM-13 visa, or the card given to refugees. 3, those born to at least one Malaysian parent but whose birth was unregistered. 4th, those left behind in Sabah following parents' deportation to the Philippines. And 5th, those who are left to survive on their own after their parents were detained for committing various offenses and or are awaiting trial or repatriation. These children, though large in number, have remained invisible to mainstream society due to lack of access to education, among other rights, in abject poverty and child labor to survive, while some are able to benefit from informal schooling, the so-called alternative learning system provided by NGOs and private stakeholders. Next, please. According to age, Filipino migrant children who left the country between 2000 and 2017 are classified by the Commission of Filipinos Overseas, or CFO, into several groups. The 14 years old and below group, totaling 205,715, constitutes the largest number of minors, followed by those in the 15 to 19 age group. These demographic trends dictate that children who leave need elementary and high school education in host countries. They may have begun schooling in the Philippines, but was disrupted by immigration. Next, please. According to level of education at the time of migration, data from CFO shows that 10,275 Filipino children have left the country while still in high school, followed by those on elementary level at 9,910. 8,556 children, meanwhile, have completed high school before immigration, while 6,099 are yet to be of schooling age. The first two groups indicate disruption in schooling. Even if they were admitted to schools in host countries, they may have experienced demotion in level or year of schooling due to different educational requirements in the Philippines and destination countries. The third trend suggests that some Filipino children may seek higher education, but they might struggle completing it, especially if matriculation is costly. In the case of Claire, she moved to Cebu, where medical technology course was more affordable than in Bahrain. Next, please. International and national laws and policies play a tremendous role in children's access to and inclusion through education. Next, please. On the international level, children's rights have modernized almost 100 years since the League of Nations adopted the Geneva Declaration of the Rights of the Child in 1924 to promote the child's development, protection in times of need, economic freedom, and protection from exploitation. The creation of International Children's Emergency Fund, now known as UNICEF, in 1948, and the world was united to secure the rights of all children to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CRC, in 1989, which was discussed a while ago, signed by all 10 ASEAN members eventually in 1995. It accelerated the promotion of universal primary education with the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals in the 2000s. The 2015 adoption of the 2030 UN Agenda was a landmark achievement, providing for a shared global vision towards sustainable development for all. One of the 17 goals is SDG 4, quality education, through ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. Next, please. To realize SDG 4, there is a need to reduce the barriers to migrant children's access to education, develop more inclusive intercultural school curricula, emphasizing social emotional teaching and learning, improve the education of migrant populations, both in the developed and developing world, as quality and equitable education results in income growth and poverty eradication. Next, please. Within ASEAN, regional initiatives on inclusive education have taken place through consensual promotion of the 2030 UN Agenda, committing to an inclusive and quality education and lifelong learning and training to respond to regional and global trends through formal, non-formal, and informal systems. This regional declaration affirms the ASEAN Sociocultural Community Blueprint of 2025, which aims to foster an inclusive community and provide a policy framework for addressing challenges to equitable access to education. Next, please. West Asia, or GCC states, have likewise made advances in relation to the 2030 UN Agenda. Aligned with the principles of the Arab Charter is the region's mission to eradicate illiteracy and promote the right to education, among other children's rights. The Arab Region Outcome Statement of 2018 has specifically included perspectives on and priorities toward migrants and their education. Next, please. Despite the influence of these international, inter- and inter-regional initiatives, nation-states fundamentally reserve the sovereign right to determine the conditions for acquiring citizenship and define who are its people and their rights. States around the world conform to varying principles of citizenship that create a demarcation between citizens and migrants in terms of access to public services such as education. These principles are jus sanguinis, or the right by blood, jus soli, or the law of the soil, and lex soli, or restricted jus soli, which means membership only in terms of children's education. States that follow the principle of jus sanguinis do not allow children born to irregular migrant access to public education due to the latter's lack of citizenship. In the states that follow jus soli and restricted soli, meanwhile, what is important is proper documentation rather than descent for citizenship. Next, please. The Philippines, which subscribes to the principle of jus sanguinis, adheres to implementing SDG 4 through a policy framework for inclusive education with the following rationales. Number 1, promote the right of every Filipino to quality education, realize their full potential, and meaningfully take part in nation building. Recognize the diversity of learners, schools, and community. Respond to the varied realities of learners and their families. Number 2, promote institutional sensitivity and responsiveness to the nature, situation, and realities of our country. Number 3, ensure that every aspect of the K-12 curriculum support system across the governance levels of the Department of Education is responsive to the needs and demands of diverse learners. I will let Undersecretary San Antonio elaborate on this later on. Next, please. A salient part of the Philippine government's response is the emergence of Philippine Schools Overseas, or PSOs. These are byproducts of collaboration between the Philippines and the countries where thousands of Filipino migrant children are. These schools contain features of Philippine curriculum since they were founded on the premise that Filipino migrant children and their families will eventually reintegrate to the Philippines. But they also adopt some guidelines and policies of the host countries. For instance, PSOs operating in the GCC states include Arabic classes in their curriculum. I think Director Apatad will elaborate on PSOs later, but this is just to emphasize that expansion of inclusive Philippine education remains to be a Herculean task that the Philippine government cannot work through alone. Next, please. On the macro level, norms, regimes, and policies toward the promotion of inclusive education have taken form and shape. However, narratives and accounts on the grassroots level are painting a disturbing and complex picture. Next, please. Based on multimedia sources produced on the theme of Filipino migrant children, children in mobility are at a vulnerable position. The Ambang, a 2016 documentary on Sabah's stateless children in the 1990s, exposes their struggle to access permanent shelter, education, and economic resources. Their lack of legal documentation prevents them from accessing basic education from the Malaysian government. The 2018 documentary on stateless children in Sabah, featured in the Reporter's Notebook of GMA7, meanwhile, shows that despite the efforts of some civil society organizations to assist this vulnerable group, access to formal education has more far-reaching effects on improving their life chances. On the internet, one documentary titled The Invisible Children of Gaya Island, that's in Kota Kinabalu, Malaysia, shows how stateless Filipinos struggle with livelihood to survive every day. Without formal schooling, these children can get stuck in child labor and prolonged socioeconomic precarity. Next, please. The 2013 independent film titled Transit chronicles the plight of Filipino migrant families following the declaration of the Israeli law to deport migrant children aged below 5 years old. It highlights the difficulty of undocumented Filipino migrants choosing to raise their children under such anti-migrant conditions. Without legal status, migrant children are at risk of deportation and bereft of rights to education and social protection. The published TED Talk of Rose Patsy Tibok, who studied on the education of Sabah's children, was an eye-opener to the so-called invisible children. And she presented the alternative modes of learning that NGOs and faith-based organizations have carried out in place of formal education. Next, please. Education is a fundamental human right, which is denied to thousands of stateless and undocumented children, as I have shown. Curious about the level of awareness of UP students on this issue, we conducted the mini-survey last March to solicit narratives on the education situation of Filipino migrant children. Data gathering unfortunately stopped due to COVID. Next, please. The precarious and undocumented status of migrant parents can be passed on to their children. Parents' lack of knowledge of citizenship laws may constrain a child's access to education. If they commit violations or crimes that could strip them of their visa, their child will also struggle to access this right. If they give birth without registration and securing proof of identity, their child runs the risk of being undocumented and unable to go to school as well. The few contributions we collected affirmed there are countries where formal education can be accessed despite a child's undocumented status. However, this is not without challenges. Next, please. Migrant children may suffer emotionally and psychologically due to their isolation within host society. They cannot interact with other children due to poor language ability, and as long as they and their parents remain undocumented, they may transmit disadvantages onto the succeeding generation. Next, please. Even 1.5 Filipino children who may have not encountered any legal barriers to education still struggle with educational inclusion on the legal and economic status of their parents in host countries. Face-to-face interviews that I've conducted revealed the following challenges. Number one, distant location of Philippine schools or PSOs, which affects regular attendance and at times leads to change of school. Number two, disrupted schooling due to changing visa statuses, companies, and job contracts of migrant parents. Number three, perceived cultural difference between them and children of citizens in host country, and even Filipino children in the Philippines. Fourth, perceived difference in the quality of education of Philippine schools overseas and those in the Philippines. These negative emotions and perceptions invoke dissatisfaction with one's educational experience, self-identity, and overall well-being. Next, please. As Claire expressed, there is inadequacy in her Philippine education experience as it has failed to transmit in her a secure sense of Filipino identity while studying and growing up in Bahrain. But what's interesting is when she arrived this April in Manila, she felt more sympathetic and worried about Filipinos more than Bahrainians because the latter has a national health insurance, education subsidies, and social protection during this crisis. Next, please. The narratives on the ground reveal the existing layered and multiple barriers to education. Next, please. The narratives on the ground reveal the existing layered and multiple barriers to education of Filipino migrant children. And these barriers are transnational in nature as they are not solely based on the structural conditions in destination countries, but are also consequences of the limitations of the Philippines as origin country. Last slide. Yes. So in summary, I'd like to highlight the following points. First, migration has a huge impact on education of Filipino migrant children, creating diverse learning needs and experiences that influence their overall development. Mainstreaming the realities of migration in all levels of education can sensitize teachers and administrators on the impact of migration on schooling outcomes. Second, the multiplicity and transnationality of barriers imply that efforts to inclusive education should extend beyond national borders. There is a greater need for regional and cross-border collaboration between states, civil society, and private sector towards strengthening the promotion of the right to and delivery of quality and inclusive education. And lastly, understanding diverse realities of Filipino migrant children helps to determine how current Philippine education curriculum can be improved continuously towards a more inclusive education. Knowing the different categories helps us to identify what social-emotional skills can be integrated into the current programs to effect change in teaching and learning. Thank you very much. That ends my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, maraming salamat, Jo, and maraming salamat for keeping to the time. I took a quick look at some of the questions that have been posted, and I think I will just read a few of them because I think some of the questions can be addressed during the in the presentations and reactions also of our panelists, and maybe some of them can be addressed during the Q&A later. One of the questions is about yun nga, considering that the population of migrant children is a very diverse profile, the question was asking, sino ba daw sa mga Filipino migrant children ang mako-consider natin na invisible? Who among the migrant children do we consider invisible? And then there's another question whether the Philippine schools consider the curriculum of the Philippines. I think we will have an answer to that when Director Marie Apatad makes her presentation. And then there's also a concern that, you know, when we talk about children having access to education, including migrant children, there's a concern that maybe some family issues can enter, you know, the access of children to education, because maybe what about if in some cases it is the families, it is the parents who do not allow their children to access certain types of schools. Okay, so we are very fortunate that in addition to the presentation by Dr. Silero, we are also joined by panelists who have a deep understanding of the educational issues of children on the move. I will introduce each one of them before his or her intervention. So first, I'd like to invite a media practitioner with a decade-long experience in the industry. I am pleased to introduce Mr. Ian Simbulan, Executive Producer at GMA Network. He is currently the Executive Producer of the Reporter's Notebook, a source that has been mentioned a couple of times. The Reporter's Notebook's episodes on Hikbi sa Ibayong Dagat and Mga Nagkukubling Anghel were conferred Migration, Advocacy, and Media Awards by the Commission on Filipinos Overseas in 2017 and 2019, respectively. May I now invite Mr. Ian Simbulan for his intervention.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ian Simbulan. Thank you for the introduction, ma'am. Actually, it breaks my heart while watching again the documentary. I've watched it many times, a lot of times, because it has been entered to a lot of award-giving bodies. I was the one who produced the episode, the documentary with Maki Pulido. We were in Sabah for more than a week, talking to different children, stateless children in Sabah. Actually, we were originally doing a story about trafficked women in Labuan. It's another issue in Sabah, Malaysia. And then we came across this story, their story, and it really broke my heart meeting them. Actually, talking to them, it's kind of painful and hard to see them, dealing with a lot of pain, a lot of fear that they might be caught anytime soon. So I'd just like to present a brief presentation. So the title is Nagkukubling Anghel, Angels in Hiding. This is the plight of stateless kids in Sabah. Next slide, please. As discussed earlier, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child on 1989 stipulates that every child has a right to a name, a nationality, and the right to education. Next. But in Sabah, Malaysia had ratified the convention in 1995, but it made reservations to some of its provisions, including the Article 7 about education and Article 28. Article 12 of Malaysia's Federal Constitution, meanwhile, guarantees the rights in respect of education, but they're available only to Malaysian citizens. So, how about the stateless? For decades, just a brief background, some residents of Mindanao arrived by boat in Sabah to escape insurgency. So, alam naman po natin, magulo sa Mindanao, and most of them, the Badjao Laut, when we interviewed them, they came all the way from Tawi-Tawi, the nearest island in Sabah. They travel by boat. Actually, hanggang ngayon, nangyayari pa rin siya because they have relatives in Sabah, and they also have relatives in Sulu and Tawi-Tawi that they visit every now and then. They end up working in Sabah with no proper documents or identity cards. Next. Their children have become stateless, no passports, no birth certificates. Next. They're called by several names: invisible children, hidden children, undocumented children, and lost children. Next. They are denied basic rights to social services, that's including education and health. Unfortunately, the children of undocumented Filipino immigrants in Sabah were not spared from the Malaysian government's crackdown of illegal immigrants. I am actually producing a story about children being locked down in Sabah. I have some leads, and actually I have photos. And if it's painful to see them inside cells. They don't deserve to be inside those detention facilities. That's why some of them learned how to live in hiding. Alam po nila na pwede silang mahuli anytime soon. Their parents are also not spared from being caught by authorities in Sabah. That's why some of them also experience the hardships of living without anyone. Sabi nga kanina ni Teacher Maligaya, one family is living sa isang cementerio with a tent, with a makeshift tent. Imagine, wala silang kahit anong pagkain, pero wala silang choice because nandun na sila. Next. To help the stateless children, learning facilities managed by community leaders have been set. Katulad po ng ginawa ni na Teacher Ligaya, who's been doing almost 10 years now. In a mountainous area in Sabah, Reporter's Notebook visited the hidden makeshift classroom. Next. Filipino volunteer, Teacher Maligaya, has been teaching stateless children reading, writing, and arithmetic for almost 10 years now. Si Teacher Ligaya, you can see her passion, the care, and her heart. She's traveling like around 2 hours every single day just to visit these kids. And she's doing it for free for so many years, sometimes without assistance from the government. There are a lot of Filipino in Sabah, so there are a lot of also of people who donate some school supplies, and Filipino volunteer teacher Maligaya is really one of a kind. Next. And I think the main issue now is that the Philippines is still asserting our claim over the disputed Sabah. We have no embassy in Sabah or consul in Sabah. So when we were doing the story, we were contacting our embassy in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, which is miles away from Sabah. So it's kind of hard to really, ask them to do something if they don't have any official in Sabah. So I think that's one of the main reasons why this thing exists. While after interviewing Nico, he constantly looked at my wristwatch. And then after that, sabi ko, ano yung tinitingnan mo? Sabi niya, he was looking at my wristwatch. It was a G-Shock back then when we were shooting. Tapos sabi ko, sige patingin yung sa'yo kasi he was also wearing one. And it was broken. Hindi po siya gumagana. Sabi ko, saan mo nakita? In English, where did you find it? Sabi niya, nakita daw niya sa rubbish while he was scavenging in near their town. Gusto mo ba? Sabi ko. Yes. So, without any hesitation, I gave him my watch, the G-Shock watch. But for me, it's a reminder that in time, I pray and I hope that there will be no hiding. There will be no pain. There will be no crackdown. Because Nico and Christine and other kids and stateless children in Malaysia and other parts of the world deserve to be recognized and deserve to be loved. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Ian.
Thank you.
Kagaya nga ng nabanggit ni Ian, medyo komplikado po yung sitwasyon ng mga Pilipino sa Sabah because of our claim over the territory, even if Sabah has already chosen to be part of the Federation of Malaysia. Actually, I had a similar experience with what you had experienced when you did the documentary. Way back in early 2000s, I had an opportunity to do field work in Kota Kinabalu and Sandakan. The topic was different, The topic of my research was different, but I was drawn to the situation of Filipino children there because I met one of the domestic workers in church, and she invited me to go to her house because she said she was going to teach Filipino kids. So that really, that invitation was very meaningful because when I got to her house, dun sa kusina ng kanyang tinitirhan na boarding house, there were like 40 kids who were waiting for her. Wow. And I was really very inspired by this particular experience because, first of all, she was a domestic worker. Wala po siyang degree in education. And she was also like Teacher Ligaya, who out of the kindness of her own heart, she was sharing what she knows about basic reading and basic counting so that the children will at least have some access to education. And at that time, I was really thinking that it was very, very unfair that, even if the children's legal status was not authorized, they do not have legal status to reside in Sabah. But, in other countries in the region, including Thailand, for example, even if a child is in an unauthorized situation, the child could still have access to education because that is very basic. So, very complicated po talaga yung situation doon. And I think there's an estimate that maybe some 5,000 Filipinos will be repatriated from Sabah and already some 500 had been repatriated in early part of July. So I guess we will also be seeing some children among those who will be repatriated back to the Philippines. But moving on, we are fortunate also that from media we moved to a government agency whose mandate is to promote and uphold the interests, rights, and welfare of overseas Filipinos and strengthen their ties with the motherland. Director Marita Del Rosario Apatad is the Division Chief of the Project Management Division under the Commission of Filipinos Overseas. She completed her BA in Political Science and Masters in Public Management from the University of the Philippines, Manila. So Director Marie, over to you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to CIFAL Philippines for giving the CFO the opportunity to share some of our experiences in terms of rolling out programs for children who are outside the Philippines. So for the past years, Filipinos continue to go abroad to search for jobs, educational opportunities, or new homes. As a result, millions of Filipino families are now situated across different countries across the globe. Professor Celera has painted a very accurate picture of the profile of migrant children and some of the challenges being encountered in terms of accessing education when already outside the Philippines. We are all aware that children normally don't have a choice, as the option for the family to migrate oftentimes depends upon the parents. And on the part of CFO, let me share the appropriate programs for migrants. We admit that education is not part of our mandate, but the welfare of migrants are. Two specific things we are operating on were discussed in Professor Celera's presentation, so let me expand on them a little bit more. We are part of an interagency committee that oversees the operations of Philippine schools overseas. And we have also provided, albeit on a limited scale, assistance to alternative learning centers, as mentioned also by Mr. Ian Simbulan. There are alternative learning centers catering to children of Filipino ancestry who are in Sabah. Next slide, please. Philippine schools overseas are duly registered educational institutions operating outside the Philippines and implementing the basic education curriculum of the Philippine Department of Education. PSOs are required to comply with the requirements and regulations of the government of the Philippines and of the host country, and a valid permit to operate is required before applying for accreditation from the DepEd. Apart from addressing the educational needs of children of Filipinos overseas and eventually facilitate their integration into the Philippine educational system, PSOs play a vital role in the propagation of Filipino culture and heritage among Filipino youth overseas, and they also serve as locus for Filipino community activities. The other members of the interagency committee are, aside from CFO and DepEd, are the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration, the Department of Labor and Employment, and the Department of Foreign Affairs. This composition was made primarily because of the unique nature and needs of schools overseas. Next slide, please. The first PSO was established in Jeddah, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1991, and the number of schools continued to grow as the years go by. But as of July 2020, there are 37 PSOs operating in 10 countries. Bahrain, East Timor, Greece, Italy, Kuwait, Libya, Oman, Qatar, KSA, and the United Arab Emirates. At the moment, we are still getting information from the school on their current enrollment at various levels from preschool to senior high school, because like the majority of industries around the world, they too have been experiencing challenges being brought about by the COVID-19 virus. This is in addition to some issues already present prior to COVID, such as workers being laid off in host countries. Hence, parents and families are coming home to the Philippines, bringing down enrollment figures. Likewise, levies imposed on expat workers may have some impact on parents not being able to bring their children abroad with them. Next, please. As you can see from the slide, these are where all the schools are located. So we have there are schools in 10 countries all over the Philippines. So next slide, please. The main benefits gained from establishing PSOs is the use of the Philippine-based education curriculum. I think this was one of the earlier questions posed by one of the viewers. So they are required to use a Philippine-based curriculum which provides for easy reintegration in the Philippine mainstream education in case they want to come back to the Philippines. Because the PSOs follow exactly the same curriculum as that in the Philippines, there's no need for subject accreditation when they return home. Duly recognized schools or those with permits to operate are given school IDs. Hence, students also have their individual learners reference numbers or LRNs. That enables them to seamlessly enroll in educational institutions in the Philippines at any given time. Extra skills are obtained from local educational requirements such as learning Arabic culture and language. And more importantly, next slide please, because of PSOs, OFW families are kept together. From 1970s to the 1990s, the Philippines has heard stories of families torn apart by the need of the parents to seek better opportunities beyond the shores of the Philippines, which prompts them to leave their children with relatives. This has resulted to trauma, isolation, relationship gaps, to name a few. Because of the presence of PSOs, OFWs are able to bring their school-aged children with them. And students also have the benefits of having dual or multiple cultures and may have a little bit of advantage in being global citizens. So what are some of the issues and concerns of PSOs or the Philippine schools overseas? Being physically distant from the Philippines. Next slide, please. PSOs naturally have issues and concerns that need resolutions and sometimes intervention. First and foremost, there is a challenge on conducting timely physical inspection visits and constant monitoring of PSOs due to the budgetary constraints of the Philippine government. We resort to documents submitted, and the IAC or the Interagency Committee has also devised virtual ocular inspections in order to get the work done and keep close monitor on the schools. And as mentioned earlier, decreasing enrollment rates are posing problems to PSOs for them to remain open. While the COVID-19 pandemic has not abated, Filipino parents here and abroad are wary of physically sending their children to school. In some countries where there are PSOs, groups offering homeschooling services with significant less tuition fees have become some sort of competition for PSOs as parents are opting to avail of their services rather than sending back their children to PSOs. This is challenging for them as decrease in enrollment also means decreased ability to provide salaries to the teachers and other school personnel. This is aside from OFWs who are being laid off from their jobs because of the closure of some companies abroad. Pre-COVID, some issues on labor problems and conflicts were present, and the IAC-PSO have at one time or another been asked to resolve some of these. Because of the fact that PSO started as a community school or established through the initiative of Filipino communities and Philippine embassies or consulates, PSOs have become over-dependent on the IAC-PSO. So they're encouraged to develop their own operations, school operation manuals, which will contain and define guidelines related to the internal governance and operations of every PSO. These should be in accordance with laws and applicable policies, regulations of the DepEd and the counterpart in the host country. Since the schools are also situated abroad, there are host country limitations, and PSOs need to comply with all pertinent host country laws and regulations. Whenever host country laws or regulations are in conflict with Philippine laws or regulations, the latter or the Philippine law shall take precedence in the matters of course content or academic program requirements being required by the DepEd. Okay, so next slide, please. So for We also provide some assistance to Filipinos in Sabah. So we have seen the clip of Mr. Simbulan, and we are all somehow affected by the plight of these children. So our assistance aims to help stateless children who are of Filipino ancestry living in Sabah to have greater access to education. So there have been alternative learning centers or ALCs which provide these children with basic reading, writing, arithmetic, and other life skills. So next slide, please. As of 2019, we were made aware that there are 6 alternative learning centers, so there may be more, but we are in contact with 6 of these, which have a registration of about 908 learners. So the youngest is aged 4 and the oldest is 18. So they also conduct extracurricular activities commemorating events in the Philippines and Malaysia, such as Buwan ng Wika and the Malaysia Day. So next slide, please. So our work started in 2012 when we were invited to participate in an assessment visit. And we did this together with the Department of Education, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, and the Philippine Embassy in Kuala Lumpur to specifically look at the needs of the children. And over the course of several years, in 2013, 2018, and 2019, we have been coordinating and sourcing out books, school supplies, and other educational materials, which were either shipped or personally turned over to the learning centers as a means to help them. In 2014, the CFO, the Department of Education, and the Philippine Embassy in Kuala Lumpur signed Memoranda of Understanding on the community-based education with the 6 Sabah-based ALCs. So this is part of the commitment of the government to help the children. In 2015, the first joint working group meeting on education cooperation between the Philippines and Malaysia met in Davao City to discuss educational activities that may be undertaken jointly by both countries. So the issue on providing access to education to stateless learners in Sabah was included in the agenda, but Malaysian counterparts informed the Philippine delegation that the issue is not only educational in nature but has security concerns. Hence, the joint working group was not the proper forum to resolve the concern. So what are some of the possible study or policy agenda related to PSOs and the Sabah project? So first, while secondary school graduates of Philippine schools overseas were readily admitted to colleges in the Philippines, there is no comprehensive study about the reintegration of graduates of PSOs in terms of adjusting to his or her new environment. And because interaction in the Middle East is very limited, we would like to see how they're able to reintegrate into the Philippine educational mainstream Philippine education system. And also, PSO graduates lack exposure to the Filipino language as they are required to speak English at all times except during their Filipino and social studies class. And when they go to college, they are left under the care of relatives as their parents continue to work in the Middle East to support their children. So this would be a great research that we can do so we can assess the effectivity of the PSOs in terms of using the Philippine education curriculum outside the Philippines. And second, to maximize the benefits of the senior high school programs, PSOs need to forge partnerships with industries, private companies for the DepEd's immersion program. However, there's a need to assess the effectiveness of the implementation in PSO of the senior high school program in PSOs, considering the host country's limitation with regard to the immersion program for senior high school. Third, next slide please. With almost 40 Philippine schools in 10 different countries and a student population estimated at roughly 35,000 today, the interagency committee need to fulfill obligations, and it may be time that the Philippine government appropriate funds to cover the cost of supervising and helping to develop the schools. Considering the work of several government agencies that has been going on since the first PSO was established, nothing has been provided for the expenditures in the General Appropriations Act. Work has been made possible through the resourcefulness of members of the IAC and the schools on their own. Next, the Public Act 10066 or the National Heritage Act was passed in 2009, providing for the protection and conservation of the national cultural heritage, among others, and which also envisaged a role for Philippine schools overseas to host programs of the Central Rizal. It will be good to know if the schools are developing or housing Filipiniana resources and assess if the PSOs have achieved their role in being cultural hubs in foreign countries. And we agree with the proposal of Professor Salero to continue the high-level dialogue on establishing a school in Sabah for the benefit of school-aged children, as they are most at risk and vulnerable, especially if not able to participate even in the simplest transactions because of illiteracy. This has proved to be challenging considering the long-standing claim of the Philippines and Malaysia over Sabah. And based on the previous assessment trips done, we have met with the Consulate General of Indonesia in Sabah, and we were informed that there is an existing Indonesian school supported by the Indonesian government catering to Indonesian children in Sabah. So we know that this is possible. And our Philippine schools overseas have developed to become an integral part of this larger transnational community that is rooted in the home country and must be viewed continually in the larger context of the current discourse on migration and development. And we believe, the CFO believes that it is only in this light that the relevance and the future of PSOs in the life of this transnational community could be best understood and fully realized. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director Marie. Mahalaga po yung naibahagi ni Director Marie about PSOs. And actually, especially in the Gulf countries, I think other countries like India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, they also have established their own schools there to cater to the children of the migrant professionals who are working in that particular region. Ang maganda rin lang din sa kanyang naibahagi is that there's also somehow some positive development in the sense that especially if I compare what was not there in the 2000s and what is there now, na meron na pong mga alternative learning centers, no, in Sabah. And if I also remember correctly, Director Marie, I think you also have several awardees from Sabah because of their involvement in providing education to Filipino children there. Tama po ba? Okay,
Yes,
thank you. Thanks. So now, our next reactor is Ms. Rodora Abano, Advocacy Officer of the Center for Migrant Advocacy. Ms. Abano has been working on migrants issues since the 1980s. Her organization, CMA, is a Philippines-based NGO that works for the rights, that works for advancing the rights and welfare of Filipino migrant workers and their families. Ms. Irene, you have the floor.
Thank you. Okay ba yung sound? Yeah. Thank you to CIFAL for inviting CMA to take part in this webinar. Of course, as a migrant advocacy NGO, we are as concerned with children, although of course limitations. Resources limit our greater involvement with children. I will focus on the recommendations that was sent to us ahead of time. Recognizing that children of undocumented migrants and stateless persons are among the most vulnerable population groups in terms of accessing education. A high-level dialogue between the Philippines and Malaysia for an agreement to build a school for and address the social needs of stateless children is an option. I am concerned though whether this would address the low enrollment mentioned in the paper, which is tied with the insecurity of their undocumented parents. lack of citizenship can greatly affect school enrollment. Some 26% of the population of the state of Sabah in East Malaysia are non-citizens, mostly from the Philippines and Indonesia. 49% of non-citizens of primary school age were out of school in 2015, compared with only 1.4% of citizen children. At lower secondary school age, 69% of non-citizen children were out of school, compared with 1.8% of citizen children. In addition, in the concept of inclusive education, they should be integrated to mainstream schools in a phased and gradual way, with special attention to language and social adjustment like in other countries. For example, Holland, political exiles children go to regular schools, but there is summer integration period and close support and mentoring from the teachers and aides to ensure facilitation and adjustment. But for short-term migrants, or in the Sabah context, perhaps special schools or the alternative learning centers, catering to them is the option. And of course, what's being proposed in the paper. The right to education should not be tied to the resolution of the territorial claims. Children must not be denied further their enjoyment of this right, because this runs counter to the principle of the best interest of the child of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Given that Malaysia has reservations regarding CRC's article on the right to children's right to education, we can invoke the SDGs and the education for all as the moral basis, and to use moral suasion to work on how we can move Malaysia to address this basic right of children, including Filipino children. I am happy to note the Philippine-Malaysia efforts to address the right to education, however, as presented by CFO. I'm also happy to note the CHR and the NHRIs of Indonesia and Malaysia's efforts also to promote this right. For the meantime, it's the role of the Philippine government, represented by our embassies, to ensure that reintegration, including education of migrant children, if and when the family decides or are forced to return, in the context of the continuing deportation of Filipinos from Sabah to the Philippines, as also mentioned by Dr. Marla. And reintegration program starts even when Filipinos are still overseas. In education, that means providing supplementary learning programs to Filipino children on language, values, history, social studies, as well as psychosocial preparation. International law also stipulates the right of parents to send their children to educational institutions based on their preference. This is in reference to migrant Filipinos sending their children to like international schools and things like that. So, especially in countries of communities that are highly discriminatory and sectarian, the Philippine and host governments should jointly work together to provide options to ensure the right to education, including the setting up of POS. But knowing the situation in Malaysia, for example, it's important to push for high-level dialogue, to continue pushing for high-level dialogue on recognizing and documenting these stateless children. The two governments, being the duty bearers, should face and act on this issue on a more urgent way. The Philippine government must make more urgent diplomatic representation with Malaysia on behalf of the Filipino population in Sabah. If the Philippine government is claiming that Sabah is Philippine territory for consistency, they must call for a stop to the deportations. Of course, they can do this bilaterally, but they can also bring it to the ASEAN forum since Indonesians in Sabah suffer the same fate. On the other hand, perhaps the government should also lobby for amnesty, which would give more security and stability to their children. Addressing the situation and needs of undocumented and stateless children requires addressing the situation of their undocumented parents. One thing that helps soften the ground, including what the video showed to us by Mr. Ian Simbulan and the other media productions that Dr. Celeras mentioned in her paper, is to research and advocate about the concrete contributions of undocumented Filipinos to Malaysia to establish the basis for regularizing our migrant workers there. Such a study has been done in Hong Kong. We believe more can be done to address the needs of the stateless children, persistently campaigning for their birth registration. It seems the registration campaign is not sufficient. Perhaps government can explore setting up mobile birth registrations in Sabah. Birth registrants are not diplomatic people, so they may not be subject to other interpretations by the other party. Related to this registration problem, as well as the other needs of children in Sabah, for example, government should budget more resources for the Kuala Lumpur Embassy to enable it to conduct more reach-out missions to Sabah so it can better monitor the children's situation and needs, including education, and address this, as also referred to by Ms. Bata. The passage of the Social Welfare Attaché Law will hopefully enable the deployment of social workers proportional to their needs. This holds true for other foreign service posts in countries where there are a concentration of Filipino children migrants who are undocumented, like what was mentioned in Israel. Even in Lebanon, CMA's assistance how to document the children of an undocumented Filipino domestic worker so that they can access education and avail of other services. They were born and grew up there and were Lebanese, not really Filipinos. Maybe all missions abroad, particularly in countries of large concentration of Filipinos, should have clear, proactive, and comprehensive education program to ensure the fulfillment of the right to education of all Filipino children. In this connection, perhaps our legislators can look at an education attaché, and education program and corresponding budgets should also be seriously considered for such countries where there are high concentrations of Filipino children. In Saudi Arabia, CMA assisted to repatriate 2 elementary school level children whose father was back in the Philippines and whose mother was arrested for being undocumented. They were left in the care of the mother's relative, who is a driver, and who had to leave the children alone because at that time, the shelter was not suitable for children. I also know a couple who went to Canada on tourist visas on the promise of a friend to get them employed. They brought along their youngest child to facilitate getting visas and entry. The promise was, of course, not kept, and while the son should have started schooling, they did not send him to school because of their uncertain future. Fortunately, they eventually decided to return to the Philippines and the son could go to school. Of course, a long-term goal is to improve the country's economy, to generate enough decent jobs that pay living wages, and to improve public services, including education and health, which are among the key drivers of migration. This will minimize the outflux of our people abroad, including to Sabah and beyond. Related to this is addressing the impunity of illegal recruiters and traffickers, and the law conviction in trafficking cases who worsen this issue of undocumented migrants in Malaysia. We also support and reiterate UNICEF's call for more comparable, reliable, timely, accessible, disaggregated data for how can we come out with evidence-based policies and programs without such data. Government has been remiss in this duty since 1995 when the Shared Government Information System was included in the Magna Carta for migrant workers. This is a must if we want to make the invisible visible, and if we want to do evidence-based lobby for child-sensitive and responsive policies and programs for them. We also support the recommendation for UP to take part in capacity building for schools overseas and in recruiting and reintegrating Filipinos abroad to complete university degree of diploma in the Philippines. But let us enjoin other state universities to also take part in this huge task. I don't know if I still have time.
Yes, it would be good if you could wrap up so we'll have more time for the others and also the Q&A.
Yeah, okay. So I just want to mention my interaction with two schools that are also mentioned in the study, and that is Munting Nayon in Athens and Munting Tahanan in Rome. I think these are two migrant and child-friendly and inclusive schools, because not only Filipino children, but also children of other nationalities go there. Of course, our teachers there are popular for their what we call TLC, the tender loving care. What I found very sensitive in these schools is that the domestic workers in Greece and Rome can bring their children earlier and fetch them later when their work demands them to be earlier or later. And so that is very convenient for the parents and very caring for the children. I'd also like to mention that the Athens government as well as the Rome government, at least at the time that I was there, supported this alternative schools for Filipinos. So I'd like to end there. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, maraming salamat, Irene, for the recommendations. I'm glad that you focused on the recommendations because those are also very important food for thought, when we have to when we think of how we can move forward and the ways forward. Siguro yung dun sa nabanggit na isa sa mga recommendations about the assignment of social welfare attachés. Actually, I think in Malaysia, it's one of the few countries, one of the few destination countries where there's actually a social welfare attaché. And at the time that we had an interview with a Philippine Embassy in Kuala Lumpur last year, the social welfare attaché did mention going to Sabah, and that in Sabah he was also able to build some kind of a core group that would help him with his work, because the distance between Sabah and Kuala Lumpur is quite prohibitive. Okay, so we go now to our final panelist. He is Mr. Diosdado M. Antonio, Undersecretary for Curriculum and Instruction at the Department of Education. Undersecretary Antonio previously served as Regional Director of the Department of Education, Calabarzon Office, and was Chairperson of the Regional Committee on Quality Education for All. He holds a bachelor's in industrial education from the Pico State College of Applied Sciences and Technology, a master's in education from Bicol University, a second master's in leadership and management in education, as well as a PhD in education from the University of Newcastle, Australia. And he also has a diploma on strategic business economics program from the University of Asia and the Pacific. Yusek Antonio, please, you have the floor.
Maraming salamat po, Dr. Asis. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. San Antonio po ang surname ko. Santo po yan. But anyway, that's fine. Nandun pa rin po yung Antonio. First, I would like to say thank you for the privilege of being a part of this very important forum. Very enlightening because it made me realize a lot of things. I wish to also convey my congratulations and thanks to Dr. Jocelyn Silero for the very clear picture that she painted on the challenges faced by children of parents who are based abroad. I agree with all the recommendations, particularly on the need to collaborate to make sure that decisions are anchored on data, and the focus on the need to capacitate people who work with this sector. I'm not so sure whether the numbers reported by our representative from the Commission of Filipinos Overseas, Dr. Apatad, the numbers that enroll in our schools are the real number of children who are supposed to really benefit from basic education services. We are not sure if there are those that are not being enrolled by their families. The Department of Education fully supports the efforts of the Philippine schools overseas. And we understand that they are threatened by the advent of distance learning during COVID-19 emergency. We had a meeting with their leaders, and we could not even assure them that there's a way for the Department of Education to stop the recruitment by private schools based in the Philippines offering homeschooling or distance education. That means that many learners in these PSOs are now studying in schools in the Philippines but still based abroad because the alternative is less costly, and of course that would be an attraction to families. And we feel that yes, there's a need for the Philippine schools overseas to be extended support. We have proposed to the executive committee the inclusion of PSOs in our education service contracting and senior high school voucher program, but there is no decision yet as to how soon this would be implemented. We also realize that COVID-19 has made us more capable of extending educational services to all types of learners in the Department of Education. In DepEd, when we say inclusive education, we refer to all types of learners with diverse needs, as already pointed out earlier, are given equal opportunities for a meaningful life in non-discriminating environments. These environments are expected to foster belongingness through culturally, spiritually sensitive, learner-centered curriculum, learning processes, delivery modes, and settings. And what have we done in the Department of Education to make sure that the kids, the learners, not only those based abroad, but even those based in the country, are provided basic education services that could be managed given the existing constraints, particularly with the announcement of the president that we cannot allow face-to-face learning until a vaccine is discovered. The first thing we did was to streamline the curriculum. We've been supported by the ACT-RC, that is also UP-based, the Assessment, Curriculum, and Technology Research Center. I think it's based at the College of Education. In streamlining the curriculum, identifying the most essential learning competencies. And we have reduced it to 40% out from the more than 15,000 or almost 15,000 essential learning competencies pre-COVID-19. We are now implementing or using the competencies for less than 6,000, with less than 6,000 learning competencies. And we have not abandoned our standards. It's still the content standards, the performance standards are the same, but we are just saying that in response to the initial findings of our curriculum review, that the curriculum, even if comparable with the curricula elsewhere around the world, our curriculum has been found to be congested. So we were really in the process of trying to streamline and identifying competencies that needed to be pruned. And we were able to do that. And after that, we said the learning delivery modalities have to be flexible. And so we offered, and we are now offering multiple learning delivery modalities, essentially distance learning through the online scheme for those with internet, digital modular for those with gadgets but without internet. We feel that they can still use the gadgets at home if we provide them with the self-learning modules in digital formats. By the way, the modules have also been designed so that our visually impaired and learners with hearing impairments could also be able to use them, even the digital ones. So we all, of course, the most popular, as our surveys have revealed, would be the use of printed self-learning modules. And then we will also use TV and radio, and we can blend a combination of any of those approaches. What this offering of distance learning delivery modalities has somehow enabled us to really reach more learners. For example, these learners abroad may now have access to the learning resources because we also made sure that there's a platform, the DepEd Commons and our learning resource platforms are available, particularly for those learners who are enrolled, who have their learner reference numbers. I also feel that although there are reservations from certain sectors on the effectiveness of implementing distance learning, I personally feel that access to any distance learning delivery modality is fine if we will be able to motivate the learners, just like what we've seen from the video of the kids in Sabah. They are so excited to learn, so they will learn. And so regardless of the situation we have now, I still feel that given the right motivation, our children, the youngsters who are expected to learn from home, will still be able to do this. And of course, we know that when parents are engaged in the academic lives of their children, children learn better. And the approach we're doing will certainly challenge the parents to be engaged in the academic lives of their own children. And I always also say that to be able to do this, there's a need for the teachers and the families or the parents and even the learners to be closely communicating. And when teachers are able to monitor what's happening through communication, I think because of the pervasiveness of cell phones, the teachers will be able to reach a lot of learners using this technology. Of course, I also would like to perhaps suggest that we have to make sure that the migrant parents need to be made to understand the consequences of the choices they make relative to the lives of their own children. As already pointed out by previous speakers, leaving them in the Philippines would also pose challenges. But I've seen from the paper that it cited that sometimes it's also okay, especially if the caregivers here in the Philippines are very responsible. But we know that really, just like in my own life, when I had the chance to leave the Philippines for several years, I insisted to bring my own children. Though it was a bit more challenging because I was not actually working, but I said it's okay even if we'll not have so much money, but we'll be together. So I experienced this, and so the choice when you bring your family with you when you're abroad, that will also entail challenges, the adjustment of your kids to the new schools, etc. So, but I think that should be part of the things the parents or these migrant workers should be oriented on before they make the final decisions. And in the Department of Education, we are very serious about extending strong support for the vulnerable. And our inclusive education concept, as I've already shared earlier, has been expanded. Of course, initially it was about learners with special needs, but now it's about all types of learners identified by Ma'am Tess earlier, who who are in some state of disadvantage, and we wish to cover them. We have in my strand, the strand where I work, I have created a TWG on these learners experiencing vulnerabilities, because we are very serious about making sure that every Filipino, regardless of the situation, will have access to basic education services. Thank you very much po. Mabuhay kayo. God bless.
Thank you very much, Yusek San Antonio, and my apologies for my mistake. Sir, I just have to follow up with a quick question, because these are two questions that I saw in the Q&A list, and I just want to ask you this right now, because baka makalimutan ko po mamaya, and I think parang importante po siyang malaman. Yung isang question po, ang kanyang tinatanong, will PSO, maybe this is also for Marie, will PSO issue a learner reference number to a returning OF child who will transfer to the Philippines and will move back again to overseas after the pandemic? Tapos may isang question po, sir, na halimbawa, yung kanilang anak ay i-homeschool nila ngayon, will there be some problems if they decide that after the pandemic, when things improve, na ibabalik po nila yung kanilang anak sa PSO? Thank you po.
Thank you, Dr. Assis. In terms of the children returning to the Philippines, the first question, I can answer the second question now. What we do is, if they do homeschooling without, like, those with the homeschool provider not being officially permitted, what the parents will do is to put their child to a PEPT, the Philippine Educational Placement Test, so that the credentials can be somehow accredited. So we'll only recognize credentials, but those that already have LRNs, I understand, I'm not sure, I think the Director Apatid may confirm. I'm not very sure of this, but my understanding is the learners in PSOs have LRNs. So there's no problem. Am I right, Director Marit?
Yes po.
Okay. So
basta po may LRA, enrolled po sila dun sa may permit at saka recognized, they will be provided with LRNs.
So yeah, that's one advantage po of enrolling the child in a PSO. But the issue now is, yun na nga, we recognize that many families are being tempted to homeschool their children because it's less expensive. But they should make sure that the homeschool providers are accredited. Otherwise, the child will have to take a PEPT before they would be allowed to go back as a mainstream learner in the traditional classrooms.
Sir, how do they make sure that the homeschool provider is accredited? Is there information on the DepEd website concerning this?
I'm not very sure yet, but the other thing that I wanted to actually share is we're now in the process of releasing a policy on homeschooling. The existing one that we have now is circa 1997, and a few paragraphs in DepEd Order 21, series of 2019. Many regional directors feel that the provisions are not sufficient to regulate homeschooling. So even this morning, it's a holiday, but the team, 3 USECs, were in a meeting until about 1 o'clock, making final inputs to that draft DepEd order. So we hope to be able to release that very soon, but I cannot give a date, but we hope to be able to do that so that we can really process the request of private schools. As of now, only private schools with recognition may be given permit to offer homeschooling as an alternative delivery mode. We have, I understand, 3 private schools now that have this permit, but I'm not, I don't have the list, sorry. And it's a good idea. We have to publish this in our webpage so people would be guided.
Thank you very much. Actually, we are already moving into the Q&A forum, and I'm afraid that because there are so many questions, we won't be able to address all of them. But we will try to maybe ask a few questions to some of the at least one question each to our panelists as well as our presenter. We are also running late, but I hope that we have your permission to maybe extend for another 15 to 20 minutes. Would that be okay, Po? Okay. So if I may, I'd like to read out this question, and I think this is a question that could probably be addressed by Joe, and maybe also if you, Sec San Antonio, can address this question as well. The question goes something like this: can the Philippines impose on destination countries to teach about Philippine curriculum, to teach about Philippine culture and society, even if the children are already in the destination countries? So I think maybe this has something to do with the idea of multicultural education in destination countries. So Dr. Joe, and maybe, I don't know if USEC may also want to address that.
Okay, what I remember is there was an attempt to open Philippine schools like in Japan, but these did not materialize because there was no support from the local government, and the ones that were eager to come up with that was just a small NGO, I think, and so that didn't happen. But then again, there have been at least universities. I know in Osaka University and in Tokyo University of Foreign Studies that offer a course on Filipino. In fact, a degree in Filipino language. So I know that there were half like Japanese Filipinos who pursued those courses, and through those channels they were able to study Filipino language while growing up and also while pursuing a degree. So I think there's such a channel. But in terms of multicultural education, I think there is not much. The efforts are quite sparse or scattered. It really depends on whether cities are pro-multiculturalism. So there are cities where, for example, they were able to produce some materials that would help teach, not only to guide Filipino residents and their families in Japan when it comes to like existing activities or policies that would benefit them, but also their children can learn the language and learn Philippine history. And I think it helps that in those multicultural cities, there are activities organized by the Filipino migrant community that allow migrant parents to tag along their children, expose them to festivals, music, etc., etc. And those contribute so much to exposing the children to Filipino values, traditions, and heritage, even if these children have never set foot the Philippines. So I think it's happening globally, not just in Japan. But as I've said, this is rather sparse and really dependent on the orientation of cities and towns toward migrants.
Mom, if I may just share a few
Yes,
of my
please.
thoughts.
Yes, please.
My understanding is, of course, the PSOs deliver our curriculum. So the kids attending PSOs are fully able to learn the culture, history, etc. I also understand that there are some countries where there's a strong presence of Filipinos that actually offer Filipino as an elective in high schools. Yeah. So that's one way to go. And I confirm what Dr. Jo has mentioned about the communities themselves organizing cultural awakening activities or that actually make the kids fully aware about our Filipino culture, even if they have not seen the Philippines. So the children of our migrant workers are able to experience the Filipino culture and even cuisine, the food. I think there are even a lot of foreigners who really appreciate our food because of the communities that are present in their areas.
Yun na po, when it comes, I think, to the efforts of Filipino communities, I think we have many examples of Filipino communities in different destination countries that actually provide this kind of education. Pero siguro yung direction po ng question is really on the part of the government of the destination countries and their interest also in providing and supporting a more multicultural education program for the children, no, that they are hosting in their territories. Marami pong mga questions at marami din pong mga komento tungkol dun sa documentary na pinalabas kanina, which was shared to us by Ian Simbulan, and many of them were really touched by the documentary, and also it raised very disturbing questions as well. So, ang isa sa mga tinatanong nila, would it be possible daw to send volunteers from the Philippines to Sabah? And how else can the government provide support to the children in Sabah? I think Director Marie has touched a little bit on that, but I don't know about the question of volunteers. Maybe Director Marie and Ian, or maybe also Rodora can address that question.
I guess tama po yung binanggit ninyo kanina, no? A lot of Filipinos or yung mga Filipino communities doon, they know the situation naman and they really help. Kung ano man po yung kaya nilang gawin, ginagawa nila ng paraan para matulungan yung mga bata or yung mga stateless kids in different parts of Sabah. There are other areas po, I believe and I understand that they established learning centers na may mga Filipino po na talagang hinire to teach these kids. But I think they're not enough because there are a lot of kids, especially in the southern part of Sabah, na marami po talaga doon kasi yun yung pinakamalapit sa Tawi-Tawi. So, it's also a challenge, I guess, kasi dito nga sa Pilipinas, maraming out-of-school kids eh. And how will you send teachers there? I think that's another question eh. I think what the government can do, at least on my perspective, when I was on ground, there are a lot of people or Filipinos who are willing to teach them also. You just have to give them avenues or to, build yung magandang resource contact para po magkakilala sila. Kasi imagine niyo po, when we were doing the docu, we were talking to different people. May mga pastor, may mga Filipinoy na business women doon, may mga volunteers, iba-iba po sila na hindi sila nagkakakilala. Nagkakilala lang sila nung pinakilala namin sila sa isa't isa. I guess it's very important to establish a single contact person, I guess, for them to be one, para po matulungan nila yung ibang mga bata na nandoon. May tanong po kanina, kinukumusta if yung mga bata doon. Last year, when we won the CFO award, we were able to contact Teacher Ligaya. And sabi niya, patuloy pa rin po siya nagtuturo doon. May mga volunteers din po na nagbigay din ng mga school supplies sa mga bata. Fortunately, na mga Pilipino din po na naging contact namin sa iba't ibang location sa Kota Kinabalu. Nagbigay sila ng mga libro, ng mga resource materials po sa mga bata. But again, yung ugat, the root cause of the problem, yung statelessness nila, hindi pa rin po yun nasasagutan ngayon.
Thank you. Director Marie, you want to add something?
Opo, for the most part din po kasi Dr. Marla, the existence of the alternative learning centers are talagang voluntary. nag-exist siya and nasa-sustain yung activities niya due to the combined efforts of the local community. For the part of the government din po kasi, we cannot provide full assistance kasi medyo tinitingnan din po natin yung political environment na paano tayo pwedeng gumalaw doon kasi hindi ka pwedeng mag-full force agad due to the claims na ginagawa natin. So, medyo careful din tayo. When we were there in the early 2012, 2013 po, parang we were not there as government officials or officers. More on talagang titingin, nag-a-assess nga po kung ano yung pwedeng ibigay na tulong sa kanila. And most of the activities also, based on our experience, depends on the tolerance of local authorities. May time na some of our team, kasama po nun the former DepEd Secretary, si Brother Armin, he was even there to conduct training, capacity building for teachers, but they were stopped. So parang depende po kung ito-tolerate nung officials na nandoon. Pero hindi rin tayo makapag-demand because syempre mahirap din na magano. So we do it on a staggered basis. So siguro po yun na din yung kulang na mas concerted pa yung efforts natin for them. But as mentioned during the joint working group, medyo matatagalan pa because this is not only an issue of education but it involves other aspects of our diplomatic relations with Malaysia.
Okay. Thank you very much, Direk Marie and Ian. Actually, yung mga ibang questions po tungkol sa kalagayan po ng ating mga kababayan at lalo na yung mga kabataan dun sa Sabah, I think many of them were also addressed in the recommendation that was put forward by Irene Abano from CMA when one of the recommendations calls for a high-level discussion between the Philippines and the government of Malaysia. Yung comment kanina ni Ian also triggered something na baka yung nabanggit kanina ni Yusek San Antonio na distance learning delivery mode might be also a possibility. Although may nakikita rin po akong challenge dyan kasi that also raises this issue of the digital divide. Na pwedeng magkaroon ng distance learning mode siguro para sa mga children in Sabah so that they will still have access to education, but somehow there's also the challenge of the technology that they can access and what is available to them. I would like to also raise this question. Ito yung isa sa mga tanong din na which was also sent to us in advance. Sabi, and this question goes this way. What are the programs provided by the Philippine government for repatriated children of Filipino migrants? Direk Marie, would you be able to address that question? And I think if she's still with us, maybe Irene can also provide some information kung may alam siyang programs and initiatives that have been provided to repatriated children.
Sige po, si Miss na lang po muna.
Okay. As far as I know, OWA has this scholarship program for OWA, children of OWA members. And we had interns in the past who went through that scholarship program. But aside from that, I don't know of any other program. I do know of a school that St. Mary's in Pasay City that has some kind of migrant children's program where, for example, they invited us to talk to the children as well as also talk to the parents and guardians. But these are not repatriated, but it includes some repatriated children, but they're mostly left behind children. But I think this is an urgent issue now, because as you said, there are 500 repatriated Filipinos from Malaysia, for example. So what happens to the children? So perhaps I hope it's not nice that it's unfortunately OWA is not here, but I think OWA can develop something along that line.
Okay, thanks a lot. No, so siguro actually that's also some kind of a wake-up call, because when we think about the repatriation challenges, I think our lens is very much focused on what do we do in terms of providing livelihood, what do we do in terms of providing health services, but kailangan din po na meron din po tayong child lens para din to alert us that there are also children who are included among the repatriated Filipinos. If you will allow me, kasi marami pong mga questions, actually kahit hindi po siya tungkol sa migrant children, maybe I will raise some of these questions kasi parang napaka-urgent po. Marami actually dun sa mga comments and questions also have something to do with the situation here in the Philippines. And I think this one is really more for Yusek San Antonio. Yusek, just to summarize some of these issues, may mga pangamba po kasi ngayon na may mga pangamba and concerns that have been raised about the digital divide. No? Sabi ng isang question dito, how can we promote inclusivity in education, especially in giving opportunities to learners learn ICT or technological skills when access is a problem? And a related question and concern is, how will the depressed families and learners whose parents were unemployed can possibly cope with education in the new normal? Can DepEd sustain their educational needs?
Thank you for the question. First, that's the reason why we are offering multiple learning delivery modalities, because we recognize that not everybody has access to gadgets and even the internet. So for families that will not have gadgets, the long tested and proven printed self-learning module. While some may argue that this is not as ideal as the online option, I think if we do not provide anything to anyone, or if we say there's an academic freeze, we will not open the school year this year, I personally feel that that would even make the divide bigger, because the children of the middle classes, even as we speak now, even if classes are not yet open, are engaged in all sorts of learning. They are able to access free online courses. And so if we will not offer anything to families that do not have access to this modern technology, then the divide will be wider at the end of the COVID pandemic. And as I was saying earlier, regardless of the learning delivery modality, I feel that it's really more about making sure that the children are motivated, making sure that the teachers are able to facilitate learning. The second point was on families that are seriously affected. We recognize that, and in fact, one effect is there's like more than 300,000 private school learners previously who are now enrolled in the DepEd schools. So there's really this challenge, and we are trying to make sure that, of course, in the public schools, while we do not have sufficient resources, we are not like UP that has lots of resources. We know that there are also sectors that extend support to us, so that we can provide the most essential learning resources needed so that learning can continue in all families regardless of their situations.
And again, the local governments are very aggressive in the dry runs we're undertaking now. It has been demonstrated that the collective efforts of everybody, plus the very creative fellow teachers on the ground, are able to demonstrate that learning will happen during this COVID-19 pandemic. We have not monitored any dry run that actually yielded discouraging results. We are really emboldened by the way the dry runs are being done on the ground now.
Thank you very much, USEC San Antonio, and I think that was a very hopeful note. And again, actually, his comments also remind us about the famous African proverb that indeed it takes a village to raise. And I think we can also add under this pandemic, not only to raise, but also to educate a child under very, very challenging times. I'm afraid that we don't have a lot of time. So I will have to close the Q&A forum at this point. But what we will try to do is we will with the help also of the CIFAL team, maybe we can the questions can be the other questions can be given to our other resource persons, and then maybe they can be addressed also in the comments section at a much later time. I'm very sorry about the lack of time. We were also supposed to view a video of the initiatives of the Diaspora for Education. The Diaspora for Education is an international network of diaspora groups in the Gulf that aims to promote global educational development through diaspora philanthropy and dialogue between the Philippines and the Gulf countries. Is it available now? Oh, okay. So we can view it now. This particular group hopes to unlock the potential of young Filipinos and inspire them to pursue service in the Philippines, public service in the Philippines, the Gulf, and beyond. The video features one of the co-founders, Mr. Froilan Malit Jr., and his experience and advocacy for Filipino migrant children. If we can view it now, then we can go ahead. Otherwise, I think that's the following.
Because of the difficulty of living in the Philippines, my parents felt compelled to leave. When I was 6 months old, my mother migrated to the United States, while my father migrated locally. My siblings and I were left behind under the custodial responsibilities of our grandparents. As a child, my grandmother trained us to work in the flower fields. At 3, 4 a.m., my siblings and I would get up and weed a farm, and we do that until 7:30 in the morning before school. If we get lucky, we'd actually earn $2 a day. When I migrated to the US, I was under that impression that things would become more stabilized, and I was wrong. Various challenges like language barriers, racial or ethnic discrimination, you name it. The small community at the local community college that I attended gave me a wider perspectives on the opportunities that are actually available for people like me. I would literally spend a lot of time in the libraries reading books about labor, migration, child labor, and from then on I shaped all my academic work and became even more serious. I've lived that life as a child laborer, and I wanted to specialize in that area and hope that one day I'd be able to do something about it, inspire or even influence other young children who are facing similar situations, not just in the Philippines, but also in other countries globally.
Thank you so much. So I'm glad that it worked out. And so you can see their address there if you want to reach them. The group does a lot of, has a lot of programs to provide underserved communities in the Philippines and beyond. And it helps a lot in promoting the relationship between diasporas and the Philippine educational system. So before we reach the very end of this program, I just want to thank all our, I just want to thank the presenter, Dr. Joe Silero, and all the panelists, and thank also all the online participants for joining us and for the questions that they have for our panel. And of course, thank you to all the people who work behind the scenes for making this webinar possible. And now the end has come, and I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Jofe Santa Rita for the closing message. Dr. Jofe Santa Rita is Associate Professor and Dean of the University of the Philippines Asian Center. His research interests include migration studies and Southeast Asian political economy. He completed his BA in History, Community Development at the University of the Philippines, Visayas, his MA in Asian Studies at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and PhD in South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Santa Rita, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marla. Namaste. As the University of the Philippines Graduate Degree Granting Unit focusing on Asia, the Asian Center is happy to collaborate with the CIFAL Philippines and with our dear partners whom I would like to recognize and thank for organizing this webinar. So I can start with USEC DADS San Antonio, Dr. Marla Asis, Dr. Miss Rodora Abano, Director Marita del Rosario Apatad, Mr. Ian Simbulan, Ms. Teresita Felipe, and our very own Dr. Joe Silero. Thank you very much. I think I should thank also our dear participants, our teachers and educators, our colleagues and friends. Maayong hapon, pleasant afternoon to all. So after listening to my colleague, Dr. Silero, and to our distinguished reactors and commentators, there are many concepts such as holistic, inclusive, right to rest, play, recreation, leisure, right to protection from economic exploitation, and many more mouthful words, in fact. And I think we and the government should seriously pay attention. But what really strikes me is the word invincible. It means a lot, in fact. It could be good, it could be bad, it could be the mighty, it could be the weak. So in this afternoon's lecture, it could refer also to people, condition, and perhaps assistance. So I'd like to say that invincible could be people, condition, and assistance. When I refer to invincible to people, I think it was mentioned by Dr. Marla and the rest of the speakers about the recognition of, and the lack of it, perhaps even in the statistical data, of the migrants to children, contrary to the usual understanding of migrant as adults only. So we have this stateless, as mentioned by Ian Simbulan, or the hidden children, as well as the condition. So we have this the invincibility or the invincible thing of hardships and challenges of migrants and the children. And at the same time, it could be invincible also in terms of assistance. The support of the government. As I said, it could be good, it could be bad, it could be mighty, it could be weak. So the presence of the assistance of the government to our overseas Filipinos and to the migrant children, we note that not much publicized. There are good assistance and support from the government that were done silently to help our overseas workers and migrants' children. And it is also invincible because of the lack of it. But please take note, in the case of Sabah, we cannot just simply go and send our volunteers there because it might be beyond the political resolution of bilateral issues between nation states. It could be an irritant also of the bilateral relations. So we have to be very careful in terms of sending our workers or our volunteers in that part of of Southeast Asia. So this afternoon, we were reminded that the big number of migrants are also children, reaching almost closely to 400,000. And these migrants children, particularly the stateless, all over the world have encountered challenges to access to education. And these include family, maybe personal, family or relatives' decision. And at the same time, it's an institutional barriers. Now, I think Dr. Silero mentioned about this, legal barriers, socioeconomic barriers, and even sociocultural and religious barriers. So let me just briefly mention this for the sake of those who came late and for those who are temporarily disconnected during the discussion. When we talk about legal barriers, there's the lack of nationality among stateless children. These are actually featured already in Ian Simbulan and of course Dr. Silero's discussion and other commentators and reactors. The absence of documentation among children of undocumented Filipino migrants and those also, of course, born out of wedlock. In terms of the socioeconomic barriers, we have the poverty and of course the migrant children were actually forced to do the menial jobs in order to help augment the family or the parents' household income. The last barrier is the sociocultural and religious barrier. This will include, even in terms of religious, cultural, and linguistic differences, that might have hampered or hindered the educational experience of our children, as featured by this reporter's notebook. And of course, the second part is the social discrimination and exclusion. The pandemic recently has also added another layer of burden to migrant children in terms of accessing educational opportunities. I will not dwell on that because of the limited time, but perhaps focus on the opportunity that this pandemic has forcefully created through the use of technology to reach out to children who are currently affected by the pandemic and those who are not able to avail this schooling in several countries. So I'm glad that Yusik Dads mentioned it, and the existing PSO or the school overseas in various countries could still be employed to deliver education to these migrant children and also, of course, request the services of our teachers, although they are already burdened or overburdened by their task. But if they can help also the Philippine government to assist these PSOs and of course the embassies of delivering remote, if not remote learning to these children. So let us create opportunities from this unfortunate global situation. In our attempt to help these migrant children, I hope that this webinar and the feedback coming from our dear participants have made the invincible visible. And I pray that whatever we got from this webinar will not just stay within us, but we should make use of this, including recommendations to widen the advocacy, to push us, our government agencies and international civil organizations to find ways on how to help the migrants' children, both the visible and the invincible. So lastly, I would like to thank our speakers, our resource person, our moderator, Dr. Marla, and commentators. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts in this webinar. To Dr. Edna Ko and her CIFAL team for collaborating with the Asian Center to hold this webinar. Maraming salamat po. To our partners, Commission of Filipino Overseas, Department of Education, Diaspora for Education, Center for Migration Advocacy, of course the UNICEF. Maraming salamat. Terima kasih banyak to all participants. Thank you very much for your questions and comments. And we apologize that due to time constraints, we're not able to address all your questions. But I believe that CIFAL team will take note of all your questions and comments, and hope that these questions will trigger more webinars in the coming future, in the near future. I hope that you will join us, CIFAL and the Asian Center, in our future webinars and conferences, both online and offline. So take care and stay safe, healthy and happy. Maraming salamat at maayong hapon sa tanan.